Bev, it's really hard to understand. It seems incredibly reckless. It's in the context, of course, of the perhaps last round of attempts to revive the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran. They seem desperate to have in on this deal, to have an end to the sanctions that are really crippling the Iranian economy. But why do something as reckless as this? Perhaps it's their way of showing that they're still potent, but it does seem a very risky thing to be doing.
It is interesting too, because as you point out, I mean, there've been several rounds of these talks trying to ease the tensions over their nuclear agreements. And also the US has actually been sort of leaning to be sympathetic towards Iran after the Trump years. How is the US going to view this, given it was so close to their assets?
Well, there's an interesting sort of twist in the detail, Bev. Iran seems to have gone out of its way. It launched these ballistic missiles from inside its territory. It claimed credit for the attack, but it told the US it wasn't targeting the currently being built very large US consulate in Erbil. It was targeting, as we've heard, an alleged Israeli safe house. Now, that gives the US an out. It gives it a way of de-escalating. So perhaps, that confirms that it's hoping to proceed with these negotiations rather than put an end to them. The reason that they are stalling at the moment, one reason is that Russia has insisted that it has an exemption from sanctions with respect to Iran, which of course is impossible in this current context. So, perhaps Iran is desperate, perhaps it genuinely wants to do this, and perhaps it's saying to the US, we could have hit your consulate, we didn't. Our target was very accurate. This is not about you.
Yeah. As you point out, things are fairly complicated at the moment with what's happening between Russia in Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and there's even been talk of easing those sanctions on Iran to help the incredible global problems with oil supplies. Was this another miscalculation for Iran?
We won't know whether it was a miscalculation until we see the end of the process. It was certainly a very, very risky thing to do, reckless. I don't think it was wise by any means, but it doesn't mean that the deal won't go ahead. I mean, there is, of course, as you say, extra pressure now to try and engage with Iran, not only for Iran's sake, but frankly, to get hold of their oil and gas. So it's a reminder that Iran has incredible military technology, including ballistic missiles that can go, these are medium range. And that if they had nuclear warheads, then that would be our worst nightmare. So it's kind of a reminder of that elephant in the room. Perhaps it'll work for them. It's really hard to say. But I mean, our 2022 bingo card is looking more and more bizarre. So who can say what might happen this year?
There's never a truer word said. Let's talk too about reports that Russia is now trying to recruit Syrian fighters to help bolster troop numbers in Ukraine. How credible do you believe that is?
Look, it seems very credible. Ukrainian intelligence is claiming as many as 14 recruitment centres across Syria. Of course, Russia has a long history of supporting militia allied with Bashar al-Assad. Bashar al-Assad wouldn't remain in power in Damascus were it not for the support of Russia. So it would be relatively easy, given that Russia can get aircraft to very few places in the world at the moment, except Syria might be one exception. It could perhaps bring people from Syria to Russia, then in from the east into Ukraine. I think the advantage to Russia, though, is more psychological. It's about trying to up the sense of fear. We're seeing this with its artillery bombardments, its use of cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. It can't get its troops within reach of the targets it wants in Ukraine, so it's deliberately terrorizing the population, adding Arab foreign fighters or African foreign fighters. There's also reports from Central Africa. Probably wouldn't do much to help it, given its problem is logistics. But it would add to the psychological drama in a way it's pretty dark and frightening.
Yeah. And so what role would a Syrian or an African fighter have in Ukraine? How would they go about it?
Well, if they're Syrian fighters, of course, there's a lot of experience fighting urban warfare in the most brutal fashion. So there's a certain dark logic to sending them to Kharkiv or elsewhere on the border, Mariupol or another city under siege. Whether they would be much practical assistance is debatable, but they would certainly be expendable. These would just be, cannon fodder. being bought in perhaps in significant numbers, perhaps in thousands, might make a bit of a difference. But at the end of the day, it's really about the psychological advantage for Russia than anything else, I think.
Yeah. And what impact do you think Russia's investment now in Ukraine, and it would seem that this is a dogged path that Putin wants to pursue, what impact might that have on Syria and that role that Russia has played in Syria?
Unfortunately, in Syria at the moment, there just seem to be no good options. I mean, this awful civil war drags on beyond 11 years. Assad without Russia wouldn't be there, but there's no one else there to square the circle. So even with Russia sinking and failing badly in Syria, I mean, oddly, in Ukraine, oddly enough, it's trying to do now in Ukraine what it's been doing for some years in Syria. That's all it knows how to do. It doesn't know how to fight a conventional war, it would seem. I don't think it's actually going to be any good news for Syria, unfortunately. If anything, Russia's more likely to double down. Putin, risks, to say the obvious, a palace coup. It probably won't happen because he's well protected. He's so paranoid. But he's clearly a man driven by delusional ego, not by rational calculations. So you can see him hanging on in Syria to the bitter end and trying to go as far in Ukraine as he can. This is not the stuff of rational calculations, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is, as you say, all calculations have really gone by the wayside. Greg, always appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thanks, Bev.